Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I understand that this evening we're to have questions on the subject of psychotherapy, so let's begin. Yes.
Mr. Branden, do you view psychotherapy primarily as an intellectual process or as an emotional process?
It really depends what you mean, because the two are inseparable. Inasmuch as psychotherapy is a process of education or of re-education, it is necessarily an intellectual process. Crucial to the process of psychotherapy is helping the patient to rethink many of his basic values, his basic ideas about life, his attitudes towards existence, and in fact, usually to help him to retrain his very methods of thinking about life itself, so that from that point of view, therapy is unmistakably an intellectual process. However, if we stopped right there, I could leave you with a very misleading impression that that means that therapy, as I see it, is a purely cerebral process in which it's a simple matter of transmitting information from the therapist to the patient, and nothing of the kind is true. To begin with, therapy is crucially emotional in that the patient's emotions, helping him to identify his emotions, and for that matter helping him to experience his emotions and thereby to become acquainted with them, is crucial to the process of teaching a patient to know himself and to understand his own motivations, so that a feelingless patient, a patient who is not deeply involved emotionally and open to his emotions in therapy, cannot possibly be cured of his psychological problems. Secondly, the process of therapy is very often emotional in virtue of the fact that we deal with highly charged material, with material of very profound emotional significance to the patient, so that he feels a great many things in therapy about the very things which are taking place during therapy. Whether it's individual therapy, where it's simply an issue of what I am saying, or in a group situation, responding to the remarks and the reactions of the other people present. One other point here, the mere process of being able to talk openly about one's thoughts and feelings to an interested listener is itself an invaluable emotional experience fully as much as an intellectual experience, meaning that the emotions are very much engaged. And there are emotional responses to this fact. There are emotional responses, as I've already indicated, to many of the things which take place in therapy. Perhaps the patient will be feeling certain emotions for the first time in therapy. The feeling that it's possible to relate to another human being in a highly intimate way about highly personal matters. So that when you ask me whether therapy is primarily an intellectual or primarily an emotional process, I can't answer in those terms because the two are so inseparably interwoven. The only respect in which I would stress the intellectual is perhaps as a corrective against a different kind of therapist who would be contemptuous of the intellectual and would put an improper stress on the emotional. And very often you get this sort of attitude among the advocates of encounter groups and sensitivity training today and so forth, where everything is to get the patient to feel, to ventilate his feelings, etc., and so forth, with very little conceptual identification of what any of it means. And it's my conviction that that kind of emotional ventilation, unaccompanied by an intellectual conceptualization of what has taken place, of what is the significance of those emotional responses, of what the patient can learn intellectually from the whole experience, without that, I believe that the emotional ventilation as such, or by itself, is of short-term value at best. I don't think it leads to permanent beneficial results. Yes, next question.
Mr. Branden, should a person undergoing psychotherapy expect that an accurate understanding of his irrational motivations will necessarily cause him to be more rational?
No, that's a mistake that many people make when they come into therapy. They naively believe that if they merely understand why they do the things they do, that will solve their problems. Actually, the origin of this error possibly may be laid at the door of Freudianism, because this was Freud's initial hypothesis when he was building his psychological system of psychoanalysis. It was Freud's original hope that when he raised to a conscious level the unconscious motivation of the patient would be cured of his symptoms. Later, of course, Freud found that it didn't work this way. Now, I will not say that it's never the case that releasing repressed material and bringing it to a conscious level results in the alleviation of symptoms, because sometimes it does. Sometimes the symptom is itself caused by the sheer fact of the repression. And in such cases, when you break down the repressive barrier and you bring the conflict to a conscious level, then sometimes the symptoms will vanish. But as a general policy, above all when the patient is concerned to correct irrational behavior, impulses driving him to irrational behavior, much more is required than merely understanding. What is required is a process of translating his understanding into action, into behavior, so that the patient has a new view of himself, a better view of himself. He raises his self-esteem by reorienting his behavior, changing his method of functioning, first of all changing his method of thinking in important respects, then as a consequence changing his way of handling his life, dealing with people, dealing with reality, and so forth. And as he changes his behavior, he overcomes his fears, and he raises the level of his self-esteem. So it's a much more complex process than merely understanding. Understanding is only the first step in therapy. It's not the end. It's the beginning. Incidentally, one last thought here, it's often the easiest part of therapy. At least I think it is. Very often the easiest part is to help the person to understand why he behaves as he does. The real work begins after he knows. Yes.
Of what importance, in your view, is the analysis of childhood experiences as an aid to the resolution of current adult problems?
That depends entirely on the nature of the problems being worked on. In some cases, it's very important. For example, if you are working with a patient who has had strong feelings of guilt or inferiority since childhood, then it's important to know what in his childhood contributed to those guilt feelings or those feelings of self-doubt. Very often, you do have to spend some time in the patient's childhood experiences and in working through the harmful conclusions which patients took out of those childhood experiences. It's not the experiences as such, of course, it's the conclusions the patient drew from those experiences which are hurting him today and which he is reinforcing. However, sometimes you deal with problems that you're able to cure without any reference to childhood experiences. A person may have tension headaches, and a person may have problems of sexual impotence, or other types of conflicts which can be dealt with without any intensive work on childhood experience on that level, or perhaps without any real work on that level at all. It really depends on the individual case. There's no universal answer.
Mr. Branden, although you do practice individual therapy, you are known to specialize in group therapy. What are the reasons for your partiality to group therapy?
Well, let me say first of all that when I speak of having a partiality to group therapy, I am not of the opinion that all therapists should specialize in this kind of work, because this type of therapy is not suitable for all cases. There are some people who come to me who I treat privately because it's clear that group therapy is not right for them. Now, it happens that the kinds of problems that interest me are especially suitable to working in a group context. Problems of anxiety, of depression, of sexual disturbances, of social inadequacy, feelings of a lack of direction in one's life, lack of purpose, a whole host of general problems of this kind. And now here again, you cannot put everybody into the same basket, and occasionally somebody will come to me who I would like to put into a group, but I can see his whole personality problems are such that he will disrupt the whole group and make it impossible for anybody else to get anything done. And in such a case, of course, I treat the person privately. Let me say now some of the reasons why I like group therapy for a large number of people for whom it is a useful way to work.